Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm really excited to share with all of you my first impressions of the Charlotte Tilbury Flawless Eye Filter in the color story Star Aura. So that's this palette over here, and it's so gorgeous. I love the sort of limited edition packaging that Charlotte does on these palettes. So you can see here, in addition to the standard CT here, we have these beautiful starbursts on the side, and then it says Hollywood over here. And then in the palette itself, the embossing has Hollywood all over it. And I must confess, when I saw pictures of this, I wasn't a huge fan of the Hollywood stuff. I honestly thought it looked a little bit tacky, but now that I see it in person, this is a really gorgeous palette. And so this is the most neutral and light color story of the three that she released all together, but this is the one that seems to be getting the best reviews so far. So even though I'm usually not a fan of really light, subtle eyeshadows, I figured I'd pick this up and try this out for you guys so that in case you have a skin tone similar to mine, you can see whether this might work for you. And I also just wanted to mention, so online, a lot of folks have been talking about the fact that this eyeshadow quad, even though it costs the same as your standard Charlotte Tilbury quad, is actually only half the amount of eyeshadow in terms of weight. Apparently, the official word from Charlotte right now is that this is a new formulation. It's more of kind of a baked or wet dry type of formula, such that you only need half the amount of product to get the same number of applications on your eye. So we'll see in the swatches and the demo in terms of how these shadows compare, but I just wanted to mention that in case you guys are concerned about the weight of this palette. But overall, these are really gorgeous shades, and I love this packaging, so I'm really hoping that this palette works well for me. I really didn't want to buy this palette in many ways because it's just not typically my jam, and also I got kind of burnt by the Tom Ford First Frost palette, which this has been compared to, but I'm hopeful. Fingers crossed that this guy works out and it becomes one of my favorite everyday palettes. So without further ado, let's dive into some swatches. So these are the 4 shades finger swatched, and I tried to go in lightly because I don't want to disturb too much the Hollywood embossing, at least for now. But you can see, based on the finger swatches, there's not a ton of depth or breadth that you're gonna get in terms of variety of looks with this. So let's do the swatches now. So this first shade is the Prime shade, and then we have Enhance, Define, and then finally Smoke. So there we go. Those are the 4 shades swatched. And I will say, just based on my initial swatches of these, they do remind me a lot of the Tom Ford formula. So not exactly, I can definitely sense a little bit of difference in the textures and the shimmers, but it definitely is a lot more similar to the Tom Ford formula than a lot of my other eyeshadows. So now looking at the pigments themselves, I would say this first Prime shade is a really gorgeous champagne kind of rose gold sort of shade. It actually has a little bit more pigment to it than I thought it would. It definitely has a very bright sparkle to it, so you can definitely tell of the 4, it is the most shiny. But the base pigment is actually a little bit more peachy than I anticipated. So that'll be interesting to see how that performs on the lids. Next up, for this Enhance shade, it's a really pretty pinky peach shade. And my hope for this palette is this will actually look pinky peach on the lids, because the problem I had with the Tom Ford First Frost was that it looked more like yellowy silver on my lids because the base pigment just did not stand out enough, and then the yellowish flip or sheen was the main thing that you saw. So I'm hopeful with this one it'll not do that, and at least based on this initial swatch, it looks like at minimum it doesn't have that yellow flip, so that's good, and it does have a little bit more of that pinky shade to it, so hopefully that translates. Next, for this Define shade, my one concern concern with this palette is this might not be deep enough for me, but hopefully this still works out. It looks like it'll at least be able to provide a little bit of definition in the outer crease. Really beautiful shade though, and also quite sparkly. In general, I would say these two are the least sparkly in this, so probably this is the most sparkly, followed by the Smoke shade, followed by Enhance, followed by Define, but they all definitely have a decent amount of shimmer in them. And then finally, the Smoke shade is actually quite interesting to me because it looks a little bit less like your typical bronze. So I was expecting this to be a little bit more kind of orangey golden bronze, but actually swatched, I sense a little bit more of a rosy undertone to it. So I'm actually quite excited for that because I think that sort of undertone might work better for my skin. So with the swatches out of the way, let's go into the moment we've all been waiting for, which is putting all these shadows on my lids. So normally I would start out with a crease shade, then smoke it out, and then add the lid shades. But Charlotte has her system where you're supposed to do this clockwise and again do prime, enhance, smoke, define. So I'm gonna try my best to stick to that today and just see if that works for me. First, just with my GSN 9 brush, I'm gonna take a little bit of that prime shade and just put it in the inner corner of my lid and blend it all over the lid as well. Ooh, this is quite sparkly. Definitely doesn't have a ton of pigment to it, which is okay. I'm trying to be very gentle in tapping this brush in because I don't want to take away too much of the Hollywood embossment. Ooh, pretty. Definitely not much base pigment, but very pretty shine. Let's actually put some of this under the brow bone while we're at it. There you can see the shine just a little bit more. Alrighty, so I kind of put it on my inner 1/3, which I think looks quite nice. So I'm gonna go in now with that same brush and dip into the Enhance shade. There we go. Just put this all over the center of the lid. This does take a little bit of building up, I think because of the nature of this formula. It sort of applies in sheer layers, which is again kind of similar to what I experienced with my Tom Ford quads. So it seems like Charlotte is going in that direction. Okay, there we go. Very, very subtle. Honestly, I don't even know if you can see much pigmentation on my lids at all, but very pretty. Definitely got that pretty factor there. And at least thus far, it doesn't have that sallow yellow shade or flip that I had in the first Frost palette. So that's good, at least. So now with my classic crease brush from Sonia G, I'm going into that Smoke shade, which honestly to me looks much more like a light shade that you would put all over the lids rather than something to give you some smoke. But hey, this is the lightest palette of the three, so I guess it makes sense. Ooh, this does apply very beautifully though. I wouldn't say it gives me much smoke per se, but it is very pretty. And now that I put this on, I do feel like it made that middle shade look a little bit more yellow, which I'm a little bit worried about, but these textures are really gorgeous. They just blend very seamlessly into the skin and are quite flattering. I definitely think this is a palette that would work well for you, even if you have more mature eyelids and you're concerned about anything emphasizing texture. These really are quite satin in their finish. So finally with Define on that same brush, I'm just going to use that to add some more definition. Ooh, okay, that's good. I feel like that actually added a decent amount of pigmentation, at least compared to my expectations for this palette. So that's good. Not gonna get a lot of color payoff with any of these shades, but it is a very pretty natural effect. So now I'm just gonna do my lower lash line. So I'm gonna go in with my Esom G27 brush and first just go into Enhance and kind of sweep that all over the bottom. So it does take a little bit of effort to apply these shadows. So if you are someone who is heavy-handed, this is the palette for you. So next up with Define, I'm putting that in the outer corner. Again, very subtle. Cleaning off that brush, now I'm going into Enhance and just putting some of that in the inner third. I do want a little bit more inner corner highlight, so I'm gonna go in with my reference number 3 brush and go into the prime shade and just layer that on top. So that is the eyeshadow look done. I'm just gonna go ahead now and do my other eye, put on some eyeliner, and then be right back. So here we are with the completed look. I went ahead and replicated the eyeshadow on this eye, and then I used my M Cosmetics brush liner in brown, and then keeping with the Charlotte Tilbury theme, I used my airbrush bronzer in tan, and also my Pillow Talk Intense Cheek to Chic, just using the center shade for my cheeks today. And then on my lips, I've had the Lisa Eldridge Lip Embrace and Muse on throughout the video. So this is the final look. My overall first impressions of this palette are somewhat mixed. So as you can probably tell, this is a very subtle look. But it's also a relatively shimmery look. So I'm on the fence about it because I definitely like very subtle looks when I'm just going to the office. I am known to just have, you know, some nude matte shades on my lids and nothing else. But this is kind of a similar color story effect to that, but with a lot more glimmer to the eyes, which is nice. Like, I personally love shimmer, but if I'm going for a more shimmery occasion, I feel like I would prefer to have a bit more pigmentation. So in terms of pigmentation, this first shade, for example, really doesn't have much base pigment at all. In fact, I think it's probably best to use either as a glitter topper or really just in the inner corner and brow bone area. It's not really a shade that I think you could use all over the lid. This shade, the enhanced shade, is probably my biggest disappointment in the palette. So again, I was really hoping that I would see a little bit more pink from that. And there's definitely a little bit of pinky peachiness there, but in general, the shade is very sheer, takes quite a while to build up, and then the overall effect is just very subtle. As you could probably see from the swatches, this shade doesn't have much shimmer at all. Even say in comparison to the smoke shade over here, the enhanced shade does look a little bit lackluster in terms of shine. And that's a little bit unfortunate because for me, I really like my all over the lid shade to have some higher impact. And then the smoke shade is nice, but just not, you know, super pigmented, but really, really easy to work with. And I love this texture for the crease area. Define is nice. I mean, as you can tell, there's not a ton of pigmentation from that. So again, you're not gonna be able to get a ton of depth with this palette. It is a really pretty shade though. Overall, I would say if you have a medium to deeper complexion, really this is only a palette for you if you like super subtle looks. As I mentioned at the top, this palette does contain half the amount of eyeshadow by weight compared to the standard Charlotte Tilbury eyeshadow quads. So it's unfortunate that if you are of a medium complexion or deeper, you do need to build this up a ton. Like, I found myself digging in a lot to these shadows, even though supposedly you're only supposed to need half as much eyeshadow. But in my case, just to get the level of pigmentation we see here, I definitely went in with my brush multiple times. That said, it is a really pretty look, so if you're into this really subtle, easy look, then I think this is a nice palette for you. It is super easy to use. The shadows blended out perfectly. Unlike my Tom Ford palettes, I had absolutely zero issues of patchiness with this, but similar to the Tom Ford palettes, I had absolutely no fallout. So I really appreciated those aspects of this. But as Charlotte did state, this is meant to be inspired by a social media filter in an eyeshadow quad. So think of this as a filter that is very, very subtle. I mean, if you left out the eyeliner that I added today, you might not even be able to tell that I have that much eyeshadow on or any eyeshadow on if you were looking at me from a distance. So if you're into that very subtle look, then I think this is an excellent quad for you. For me personally, I think I'm gonna have to experiment a little bit more with this because part of the challenge with quads is the nature of them is you can't make a ton of different looks, But I'm gonna try to see if, say, like, you know, if I use the defined shade more so all over the lid, if that gives me a slightly more pigmented look, or if I can use this prime shade more as a glitter topper, how that will work. Let me just actually go ahead and test that right now. So I'm gonna get a little bit of that prime shade on my finger and just lightly tap it on the center of the lid and see if that helps us out a little bit. Okay, I think that kind of worked. Okay, so I definitely think you can use this shade as a glitter topper, but the downside of it is if you're looking for that pinkness from the enhanced shade like I was, I think putting that prime shade all over the lids just further made everything really golden and peachy rather than pink. You know, if you're going for that, that's totally fine. For me personally, I just like to have a little bit more pink from these shadows because I find the gold just kind of blends in even more with my skin tone. So there we go. We have a really pretty shimmery, basic look, I would say. I will keep on testing out this palette and let you guys know what I think over time. It's funny, when I added on my cheek products, I felt like, wow, they're so much more pigmented than the eyeshadow, but that's okay. I mean, you know, it depends what kind of look you're going for. And this is a really, really gorgeous palette. So definitely has that going for it. So that's all for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed this initial impression, swatches, and demo of this palette with me. Like I said, when I was researching this palette, I felt like it was a little bit hard to anticipate how it might look on someone with my skin tone that's like medium to tan and very yellow in undertone. So I thought it might be helpful if I picked up this palette and showed you guys. So hopefully this has been informative. And let me know if you've picked up this palette or any of the other flawless eye filters that Charlotte recently came out with and what your opinions are. Because I really love the packaging of these palettes and the formula seems really exceptional. But yeah, I will say I am a bit underwhelmed by the overall effect that I'm seeing on my lids from this look. But who knows, you know, I'll wear this around, I'll try new looks, and I'll keep you guys posted on how everything goes. So thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!